Good afternoon, everybody. We start the fourth webinar session on the legitimacy of European constitutional orders. We have already been covering quite some ground, and we will cover even more today. We have three very rich papers dealing, as always in the case of European constitutional traditions, with trauma, atonement, and ambivalent success, as always is the case. We are dealing with Germany, Hungary, and Spain, and we are dealing with the ambivalences in terms of how to conceptualize, how to imagine, how to theorize about the transformation that have taken place in these countries, and that they are still moving targets, as the papers, I think especially in the case of Hungary and Spain, cannot but reflect, even directly or indirectly, as you know, for very obvious reasons that I will not mention now. Germany seems to be a much more stabilized country, we hope, and we pray that it remains so. But without further ado, we proceed to the presentations. Before I do that, I want to emphasize that the chat is open from the beginning of the webinar, and that the audience is more than welcome to pose questions that would be then collected at the end of the presentations, the intervention of the discussion, the intervention of Professor Ackerman, and the replies of the paper givers. But if you already start typing when you have the question, then there will be a better chance to organize the discussion afterwards. Without any further ado, I give the floor to Justin, that will be talking to us about Germany and, intriguingly, about the charisma of the German Federal Constitutional Court. Please, Justin.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here and for organizing the conference. It's wonderful to be here to discuss the work of Bruce Ackerman, one of my beloved teachers and mentors. 15 years ago, I got admitted to the Yale Law School and decided that I needed to know a little bit about law before I showed up, and decided that a way to do that would be to read some of the works of the members of the faculty. I decided very scientifically to work through the faculty alphabetically, but didn't really get past the A's. I started with Ackerman and Amar, and I'm still there, and it's wonderful to comment on his work and to be here with Michaela, who was a classmate at Yale, and unfortunately for her, has to listen to me, I think, 3 times within the space of a month. So I apologize for that. The title of the session is Questioning the Elite Pathway, and I'm going to take that in a literal sense, in the sense of posing questions rather than disputing or contesting. I think it's a little bit unfair in the sense that Bruce has given us 3 or 4 pages about Germany in this book. And so I'm posing questions looking forward to the next book. One preliminary observation, the discussions in previous days have called to mind Isaiah Berlin's famous invocation of the fox and the hedgehog in terms of the nature of our discipline. Should we be foxes who know many small things, or hedgehogs who know one big thing? How broad should the scope of the inquiry be? Almost all of the responses that I've heard have taken some form of the objection that things are a little bit more complicated when you look closely at the individual case. But if we look too closely at the individual cases, then the possibility of meaningful comparison vanishes. And so the big question is, should the field of comparative constitutional studies be more ecumenical and allow foxes and hedgehogs and everything in between? Should we aspire for some kind of Goldilocks solution where we get just the right balance between breadth of scope and specificity of detail? I raised that preliminary question as as a concession of sorts that would be a little bit of a hedge of a fox and talking about Germany, whereas I think Bruce Ackerman, for me, is kind of the quintessential hedgehog. There's always a big idea driving the project. So in turning to the case of Germany, I want to raise the question of what do we mean when we talk about legitimacy or authenticity? Is this a normative concept rooted in democratic or political theory, or is it an empirical concept in the sense of diffuse acceptance? And my suggestion is that if you consider the German case under the latter perspective, that this quintessentially elite construction constitution has somehow managed to acquire really diffuse acceptance, although it was crafted by elites in 1949 and not submitted then or ever after for popular endorsement or authorization. The German constitution enjoys enormous popular approval, as does the German Constitutional Court. The court is more popular by far than any of the politicians whose work it supervises and constrains. And I offer a brief account in my paper of how that came to be. I won't review that now, but I raise the notion, which is intended to sound a little strange, of the charismatization of the Constitution, or the charismatization of the Constitutional Court. Now, the obvious objection is, well, there's nothing charismatic at all about the German Constitutional Court. These are 16 justices whom hardly anybody knows the names of. They do their work in this sleepy, quiet town down in southwest Germany. This is the opposite of charisma. This is elites working in comparative obscurity. And my response would be, well, I think that it is a kind of charisma. It's a very German kind of charisma. This is what people like, and I raise this as a question: does charisma need to be something that mobilizes the masses in a kind of chest-thumping, flag-waving burst of enthusiasm, or is charisma simply what the people approve of and support and admire? So that's a question that I raise. I would sustain that there is a form of constitutional patriotism in Germany. I was asked a couple of years ago, to give a talk on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the German Basic Law, and I read what all the newspapers were saying about the Constitution, and it was a series of mostly encomiastic praise for the Constitution. It was something that could only be described as a kind of quiet, modest, but unmistakable constitutional patriotism. So the big question I ask is, what do we make of a regime that has always remained an elite project, but that has acquired diffuse support and something like a localized form of charisma, or at least a broad and deep constitutional patriotism, which is broader and deeper than what has followed in other jurisdictions that have followed other paths. A couple of narrower questions. One question is, to what extent does the form of construction shape the path that follows, as opposed to the path that follows being shaped by external or exogenous factors? Another way of posing the question is, how much difference does it make in terms of the ultimate fate of the German Constitution and the German Constitutional Court that this was an elite construction as opposed to a revolutionary construction or an establishment construction? Does that shape how things play out moving forward, or is the subsequent course rather a product of factors of geopolitics or political economy? Flora and Meinel raises the point this way: is that wouldn't any constitution have been successful given the socioeconomic and geopolitical circumstances of the Federal Republic during the economic miracle and the post-war boom. You could argue to what extent the Constitution contributed to these factors. Things probably work in both directions. But I'd be interested to see in the second volume a sense of the contingency and external constraints that shape a constitution's course, regardless of where the pathway starts out. A second question would be, what do you make of the major figures in German politics after the Second World War? How do figures like Adenauer or Willy Brandt or even Angela Merkel compare to some of the figures that are the heroes in, or at least the protagonists of revolutionary constitutions? How does Adenauer compare with de Gasperi? How does Adenauer compare with de Gaulle? A third question is, how does the authenticity challenge evolve over time? Can the authenticity challenge ever be cured short of some kind of referendum, short of some kind of popular endorsement? I think if you had a referendum in Germany today about whether to keep the Grundgesetz or to call a constituent assembly and do something different, my prediction was that the Grundgesetz would win out. I can't prove that. But even if such a referendum were held today, or a constituent assembly was called and decided to accept it, would that fix the problem? Would that cure the what Bruce calls the authenticity challenge today? And finally, I'd like to raise the question of the role of memory. Renata, who's on this panel, wrote a lovely book a few years back about the use of history by constitutional courts. I've written a book recently that's engaging with similar questions, focusing on the memory of evil. And the question here is that, can an elite construction court or an elite construction regime acquire authenticity or legitimacy, acquire some of that revolutionary charisma by successfully casting itself as the antithesis of the repudiated regime that preceded it? So as even if the German Constitutional Court was created by elites and is staffed by elites, if it successfully presents itself as an anti-Nazi institution, as the institutional guardian of a constitution that successfully rehabilitated the German state, helped to democratize it, helps to exorcise the demons of Nazism, is that a way of acquiring something like revolutionary charisma? And how does this issue play out in other pathways? So South Africa is one of the case studies in this book. That, I think, is a dramatic example of a court that is constantly assuming the mantle of the anti-apartheid liberation movement. The court is constantly invoking the memory of apartheid to underwrite its authority. Whereas I don't see the same thing in Italy. The first judgment of the Italian Constitutional Court is a case where everybody knows that the underlying law was a fascist law, and the judgment gets celebrated even by contemporaries as an anti-fascist gesture. And yet direct invocations of fascism, I think, in the jurisprudence of the Italian Constitutional Court are comparatively rare. I'll close there. Just raised a handful of questions that I will be delighted to hear Bruce's initial responses to here, and Michaela's and others, and look forward to seeing a fuller explanation in the eagerly anticipated second volume of this great project.
Now it works. Thanks a lot, Justin. Marvelously on time. Now we move to the Hungarian case, and we will be hearing a lot about one of the key developments, key strategies in many ways that we have been confronted in the last years, the victimization or the argument of victimization on the side of Christians. This is the turn of Renata, please.
Thank you, Agustin, and maybe we can try for sharing those slides. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So I can happily go without them. Okay, fine. Then I'll just give up on the masterful slides. So let me start from how much I enjoyed the book, and when I got the invitation, I was really deep in several projects on illiberal democracy and its constitutional angles. And what I kept asking when I was engaging with the book and then the essay was, how do illiberal Democrats fit in this architecture? Assuming that they are part of a global story and knowing that Professor Ackerman has very little patience or interest in totalitarian uses of constitutions. And I contend that illiberal Democrats are actually enjoying or manage to get to a unique form of charismatic plebiscitary leadership, where they run on popular public acclamation and various forms of public participation that have absolutely no consequence for their longevity in office. So this is a form of public participation in politics and including in constitutional politics that doesn't translate in any way into accountability. This is in large part due to electoral engineering, which even which helps these people to get elected or re-elected. And this is where we run into an interesting classification dilemma if we use the three pathways from the book, because they are elected into office on an elite pathway. And in all their constitutional engineering and hyper-legalized projects, they are supported by a bureaucratic establishment and a political establishment, which enjoys great continuity in office, at least formal legal continuity. So that actually brings me to the relatively easy travel between the three categories, depending on where our starting points are. And I don't want to reignite the entire debate with Martin Laughlin, but I find it really important. And had I started earlier focusing on Hungary in '89, including '89, then this ambiguity would have been even more pronounced, because that's another instance of constitutional continuity where a bureaucratic Ministry of Justice actually fully supports the roundtable talks, which are elite negotiations installing profound constitutional change. So instead, I settled on trying to play with the revolutionary pathway for the paper, in part because one of our favorite protagonists or villains, Viktor Orban, declared shortly after his 2010 election that what happened in the voting booth was a revolution, and he is going to put in place a new constitution. Now, it's very, very clear for those of us who have a memory that goes back a decade, that there may have been a leadership and a political crisis in Hungary. There was definitely no constitutional crisis. There was an economic crisis, but no party in the 2010 elections, including that of Orban's Fidesz, actually campaigned on a platform of constitutional change. And this is at this point where I think that I have to introduce the pickle that I have with the revolution, with the definition of the revolutionary pathway. And I promise I'm not going to take the same fight as Andrew Erato did. So have it with Andrew, please. But rather about revolutions and constitutions, but rather the significance of Professor Ackerman's ambivalence or ambiguity throughout the project about what's the point or role of constitutionalism for a global scale constitutional comparison. And before I go into some elements of what I found interesting in the illiberal story, let me just put two reminders out. Illiberal Democrats are using the very familiar structure, terminology, institutional solutions of liberal democratic constitutions to remove constitutional constraints on the exercise of executive powers, so to arrogate executive powers. And they also remove accountability over whatever the leadership does through these familiar constitutional tools. The second point, which I would like to, like a second pin that I would like to put on the board, is that most constitutions, even the most revered liberal democratic ones, provide textual anchoring for diverse political aspirations. Some of these are welfarists, others are communitarian, again are liberal, again others are nationalistic, nativist, religious. So all constitutions come as a mixed bag of promises, and it largely depends on stage 3, 4, 5, depending which one of these promises get activated by democratically elected political leaders. Now, with this terribly long introduction, as I said, I decided to toy with the revolutionary framing, partly on account of Orban's declaration of the revolution in the voting booth, and partly because in 2004 he actually gave a name to this project he was on. He decided to call it an illiberal democracy, and he made it very clear that this is going to be a massive social and political transformation to which constitutional language was tailored and then adjusted gradually. So the perfect fundamental law that was written on an iPad on the train to Brussels has been amended for the 9th time in last December. And it's very clear that while Orban does get re-elected, his popular support is obviously nowhere near the 2/3 of the entire Hungarian population. Actually, electoral modeling shows that had he not done careful electoral engineering in 2014, he would have lost the elections and all with using the previous electoral map. So we have lots of plebiscitary mobilization, government-sponsored social movements, pro-government rallies supported by the government, but these are not really translating into formal constitutional accountability. Now, this kind of project that the Prime Minister is on is very often described in terms of populism, and I don't really think that simply treating it as nationalist or even religious identity politics helps us a great deal, because it doesn't really grasp the nettle. The problem is not populism. The problem is the removal of constitutional constraints and any kind of accountability for what is done what is being done in the name of the people. Now, if we look at this kind of political action, not only Orban, but also in the paper I look more closely at Poland, but practitioners of the genre include Bolsonaro, Modi, and definitely President Trump. It seems that a very important magic trick in the engine room is the politics of victimhood, which is also an ingredient of identity politics. The genius of victimhood is that it has elements of betrayal and injustice, that it carries with it a very strong sense of moral indignation and moral superiority. There is plenty of psychological research that shows that victimhood narratives create group identification without personal experiences of harm. So in order to belong to this victim group, you do not actually have had suffered any of the harms that are being invoked. And in sheer constitutional terms and terms that are very important for the revolutionary normalization of leadership, victimhood narratives flip the democratic majority into the narrative position of a threatened moral minority. So in a way, people who vote for Fidesz or peace actually vote for the opposition. They vote for the political force, even for the third time, that claims to restore something that caused injustice in the first place. Now, this sounds extremely counterintuitive. Nonetheless, this is crucial to keep in mind. Now, a special genre of victimhood was active. I mean, it was planted in the fundamental law early on from the start, with references to Christianity and the suffering of Hungarian Christians on behalf of Europe from the start. It was activated by Orban himself in 2018 when he declared that he's on the road of building a liberal Christian democracy, because Christian democracy in his head is by definition illiberal. He managed to do it at a coal anniversary, partly to piss off German Christian Democrats because they had a little bit of a beef in the European Parliament. But ever since then, this script of Christian persecution has worked wonders in order to sustain plebiscitary mobilization in Hungary. In the paper, and Mihaela, I'm not going to read those out, there are a zillion examples of showing Hungarian and Polish parallels. It turns out that in terms of sheer ideology, the machine doesn't run in something locally produced. So it's not true Hungarianness in action. Actually, it's putting a Catholic script of combating gender ideology and also combating ideological colonization that we see at play. What we can tell from the Hungarian and the Polish project is that Christian victimhood is extremely easy to script into constitutional language, into preambles, protecting family, protecting marriage, education, church-state relations. The project is the text itself is super versatile, and it's an inexhaustible resource for mobilization. So I think that looking at those examples that I give in the paper show an alternative path, explain the difference between plebiscitary mobilization and the type of revolutionary mobilization, which underscores the revolutionary mode in the original tripartite scheme. And also it shows that illiberal democracy is extremely adaptable with plenty of learning. It's very resilient to change. So we are better to treat this as a modality of constitutional existence instead of a transient phase. And at this point, I would really like to push Professor Ackerman to say a little more on where he stands on constitutionalism. We know Martin Laughlin is against, but I do think that that these illiberal Democrats teach us things that are worth learning. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thanks a lot. We are moving perfectly within the schedule. The third paper comes back home, talking from Spain, and Marianne will be talking to us about the peculiar constitutional trajectory of Spain. long taken as a success story of elite constitutions. Perhaps now we have second thoughts also about the limits of the exercise itself, but we will get to know more from Marianne's intervention. Please, Marianne. Do we have a problem?
Perhaps now?
Now it works.
Yeah, no, it's because of this, because I'm here in the office. I have not tried before. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this feast, to this seminar. And I have also to thank very much Bruce Ackerman for allowing me to go into a kind of observation or research I was not used to. I have also to say that my first impression, my first moment after reading the plan of this research was a little bit skeptical. I will not go again over some of the issues we have been discussing these previous days, but I have to say that it's true that combining the historical approach and the theoretical or conceptual or doctrinal approach is always, well, has its complication of adjustment, because we know that there are many kinds of constitutionalism in theoretical sense, and we know that each epoch, each period has its own constitutionalisms. And this not to mention that in each country, we have a whole story of evolution of constitutionalism. So this all together makes it quite difficult to organize the work of the comparatist. And as we know, and I think Bruce Ackerman is very clear in this introduction, we can only compare what is comparable. So the first important and difficult task is to define the scope and the terms of comparison. And I agree that Bruce Ackerman has made a really relevant effort of proposing a scientific kind of work. It is like really observing, being an observer, and then analyzing, and then discovering patterns, and only after interpreting. I agree that he's trying not to judge, not to include the judge of value. So he warned us that he will not pass philosophical judgment on which kind of pathway is better. Although, and I will be back here later, although when we confront these problems that are in the DNA of the constituent processes or procedures, so these vulnerabilities of different systems, I find that the authenticity problem is a really big one. So it in some kind, it is converting the constitution in a kind of chance, something that is not, it's not authentic, it's a different issue. So what's that? I do not agree with that conclusion, but because of that, I'm very, very interested in discussing, and I will be pushing this point later. So the first thing is this about what are we really dealing with in terms of constitutional doctrine and mixing with establishing the historical contexts. And on the other hand, I have also kind of a problem with the theory of legitimacy, probably because my training is a little bit lawyerly. So I've been working as law clerk in the constitutional court. So constitution is law. So above all is law. So we do not speak about fair laws, or more or less, yeah, better in the sense of making justice of this law. So is valid or not, is to be applied to this case or not. And in this sense, and from this point of view, this is very Kelsenian, I know, legitimacy is merged in legality. So if, indeed, I think also in Italy, they speak about legittimità costituzionale. So this is really legality. This is the constitution in force. So the constitution is a norm, hence it is a norm. It is legitimate, no? This is and creates a constitutional legitimacy. I know that in this project, legitimacy is explored in a different sense, more in the sociological sense, probably. And I understand that it has to do with social acceptance, or perhaps the consideration of the constitution as something that the community can embrace, as something that all the people in a way are owning. And this is a different process. So it has a lot to do with this idea that the law, I think at the beginning of the introduction, the sentence is law legitimates authority. So there is also a say, a Latin say, which is quid legibus sine mores. So the laws will not work without customs, without habits. So we need Democrats to have a democracy, and we need people really willing to believe in the power, in the force of the Constitution. I would like to leave all this discussion, but in my understanding of the Constitution, this performative force of the Constitution, this symbolic force, is really central. So I don't think the Constitution is the main important part of Spanish transition to democracy, but I think it is the breaking point. Well, this is the bridge with the past. So from the moment in which we have the Constitution published and enforced, then we can speak of pre-constitutional order and the constitutional order. So what also Bruce Ackerman has called the new beginning. The problem is when we speak or try to explore this idea of new beginning in not only in legal terms, but in political terms. So I have to say that usually my approach to transition was exclusively about the legal transition to democracy. And it's even bizarre, the legal transition to democracy of Spain. Still, I find that it is tricky, it is difficult, but it's intriguing and very interesting to try to combine the historical exploration of this context of the transition and the better known for me legal transition to democracy. So that is why, because of this review of your project, I went into a variety of new books about the transition, probably the most studied and revisited historical period in Spain. I also have a problem with including the Spanish case in the elite construction pathway. I found, first I remembered, and then I went into a text by Bruce Ackerman that I have here, and I am only to read some lines. It says this: A piece of paper calling itself a constitution can be many things: an empty ideological gesture, a narrowly legalistic document, or a profound act of political self-definition. But we do not have a powerful literature describing the conditions under which constitutions of the third type come into being. I try to fill this gap, at least in part, by arguing that the dynamics of revolutionary activity and the processes of constitutional promulgation may have a synergistic effect, get into a situation in which a constitutional text can become a potent political symbol of national identity. Then there's a footnote. And in this footnote, what appears? A constitution can also win legitimation through evolutionary processes. The most recent success along these lines has been in Spain. So I was hooked by this note, and it is interesting to find now that this project is now being developed. But at this moment, I think this elite construction path was not clearly envisioned, and I have a problem with this path. Really, I have no adult problem to be in companion of Germany. We have learned so much from Germany and from Japan. I have not a great Japanese culture, I confess. So, and I'm not. It's not spontaneous that I find similarities between the Japanese constitution or Japanese system and the Spanish one, or about cultures, constitutional cultures. But the case is that I find so idiosyncratic the Spanish transition to democracy because of the conditions in which it starts, that I find difficult to include in this same type, under this type, the reunion of these different. So, because I know that I am consuming my time with this prolegomena, I will simply signal a couple of issues that worried me, and perhaps later we can go deeper into this. As you all know, the dictator, General Franco, died in bed. So that is one. But the dictatorship did not die in bed. So it's not like in other places they say, so we were under a republic and then we started to be under another regime. The process of transition to democracy in Spain was quite long and quite hazardous. And from the very beginning, at the wheel were insiders, from the beginning to the end. But these insiders were not with a clear vision where the travel was going towards. So the promised land was not clear in 1975 when the dictator died, and started only to be clear in 1977. So during 2 years, things happened, and happened a lot of things. So what we have is a lot of conditioning factors, all of them influencing the final result and the direction of the process. A lot of interveners have mentioned some of them, and I agree absolutely. So it was something very deliberate to avoid something similar to the revolution, the Portuguese Revolution in Spain. So, and this was something felt as a threat, not only for Spaniards, or say the people in charge in Spain. It was considered a real danger for the United States, for France, and other countries in Europe, who were in a way monitoring and clearly observing the Spanish transition to democracy. The recent literature on the transition is very clear in emphasizing that is not, well, it's a mistaken view that very well established for a while, that it was a pact within the elites or from above. So there were pacts among people from the political parties or those who had some influence in the political events, and that was all. So that was the way. It was not, the social unrest was enormous during the whole period of the transition, with strikes, with political, social movements with students, with workers, and of course appeared the phenomenon very savage of terrorism of a variety of groups. So it was a violent moment in the streets, even if I agree that the people after 40 years of dictatorship was demobilized. But as one of my friends who spent some years in prison during these Francoist years says, it is not the same to be apolitical under a dictatorship with a powerful apparatus of repression than being apolitical in a democracy. So when people had the possibility of expressing their aspirations, it was clear that in Spain, nobody wanted the continuation of Francoism. And that was quite clear. So the direction was not well established, but the need to look at Europe, the need to homologate with Europe, the consciousness, the awareness that Spain was a poor country that was really left behind, was something very spread. And that had a big part on this anxiety about doing something and doing something with some expectation of success. I'm closing, so I know that I am approaching the end of my time. I think that what is discussed now, and now we are in a process of reviewing the transition, is which is the value of the Constitution in order to close the so-called novel of Spain. So the story of the two Spains that were confronted in a very bloody way in the war. So the idea of the Constitution as the symbol of reconciliation, in that sense, a proper new beginning. This is something that is questioned in this moment, because there was a legitimacy prior to the Francoist sublimation, the Francoist dictatorship. So some people is now claiming to establish a clear link between the democracy of today and the democracy during the 30s in Spain. So I know we are not Austria. No? Austria could recover the 1920 constitution. That was not possible in Spain. But there were issues, say, falsely closed. And that is a problem. I can't see the authenticity problem as is put in the introduction, but I find that there is a problem with the reading of the symbolic value of the Constitution. Thank you very much, Agustin.
Okay, so we move straight into the discussion, which will be led by Michela. Please.
Hi, everyone. So I had 5 pages of notes, which I have mostly crossed out while people were talking. So let me let me try and take this up again. So what I was going to start with was a more general remark on Bruce's elite pathway and then move on to the papers. But maybe I can draw the two more together than I initially thought I would be able to. But please bear with me if I'm a little bit unstructured and confusing. And you can challenge me on that later on. As I'm still thinking, I don't have clear answers myself yet. So what it seems to me is that the elite pathway Bruce is operating with is running into this, as he argues, this authenticity problem, right? And that is a problem that is specific to that particular pathway, whereas the other two, revolutionary, comes with a certain charisma for the revolution if the constitution if the constitutionalization of the charisma happens, provided that. And the insider model basically relies on sort of tradition as a basis for legitimation. In the elite pathway, Bruce tells us there's kind of a gap. And so my question to him would be, if there's a gap, then what's the explanatory power of that model? Is the explanatory power of the elite pathway in that case that there is a gap? Is that sort of the main thing this is be borne out? But I'm not entirely sure that's actually the case. I think there are things we might think about, but that's the thing that I've only been thinking about while people were talking. So let me get to that in a bit of a moment. So on Justice's paper, first of all, I mean, I think Justin is obviously right in terms of assessing the popularity of the basic law and so on. And I suspect he's also right in pointing to the fact that sometimes we exaggerate the degree to which we can explain things by certain structures, and that there's a lot of contingency at play in that German model. That said, where I think I would like more, and this is what I want to push Justin on a little bit, is the fact that the basic law has come to play such a prominent role in the success of Germany now suggests that there must be, something that goes beyond, Germany having a fortunate political development over the post-war years and a sort of good economic development. So if the nice economic story and political story is all there is, then why are we not sitting here celebrating 70 years of the Federal Republic, of German democracy, but we are sitting here celebrating 70 years of the Basic Law? So in that sense, I think I would like to hear a little bit more in terms of what you think plays a role in that story. And I think there are multiple suggestions out there, right? I mean, one is perhaps there's sort of compromise consensus model that's going on. That's the basis for the acceptance. And is that sort of in some ways related to sort of a Weberian rational authority concept, which is interesting that Bruce doesn't go down this route himself in the book, actually. So is that sort of an alternative explanation or something that is there but not quite worked out? Or is there a different story going on? Is German constitutionalism perhaps just sort of perpetuating longer German anti-democratic traditions? Or is there a specific content of the Constitution, a specific goal the Constitution pursues, everyone can rally behind? And that would be then, I mean, I've written along these lines, and that would be connecting to what other people have said, Marco and Augustin in their paper, and people in the chat now. Is that sort of a project of a social and democratic state? And because such a social and democratic state in Germany is something that is, against the background of German history, quite revolutionary, this is also the element of overcoming the past again, right? And this brings me then to Marianne's paper, which I have read, but I think which she just sort of needs to develop more in the paper. And she's done that to some degree now in the comments, but there were a number of sort of factors at play. And again, I would like her to say a bit more in terms of what she thinks is the most important one. So there's been, in the paper, when I was reading it, my sense was that she's emphasizing very much the importance of compromise and consensus. Now, that seems fair enough, but she's also brought in, she's also talked now about the importance of a bridge to the past and a break with the past, the importance of reconciliation. And if that's the case, and I'll get to Renata's paper in a second. If that's the case, let me ask the question, is it accidental that in the elite cases Bruce considers so far, we all have that break with the past? Or is it perhaps not accidental? Is it the case that we have only an elite model because, you know, we can't trust the people in that particular initial original situation, and we can't trust the people because there's been a bad past, in which case sort of the revolutionary overcoming the past would actually be connected to his pathway. I'm a little bit suspicious of that, but that's, I think, something we might think about, and perhaps this is in the direction in which Bruce might be going in a second volume. He can tell us that better than I can. Now, with regard to the Renata's paper, which was very dense. So I have a few sort of clarificatory questions, and I didn't, I think, understand it properly when I was reading it. So as I understand you now, Renata, you're saying that Hungary basically comes from an elite pathway, but is then developing sort of revolutionary modes of decision-making, but it's not revolutionary in the sense of strictly conforming to Bruce's model, having mass mobilization and so on. But there's a certain, there's a sort of fake revolutionary mode going on, and that fake revolutionary mode consists again of two elements, it seems to me: a sort of revolutionary populist style with the strongmen, with the emotional appeals. I was wondering if irregularity or even sort of illegality to some degree is a feature of that as well, as you would describe it, or perhaps not, because a lot of these changes that we've seen populists making have been regularized in sort of ordinary constitution making. So maybe that's no longer a feature there. But that's sort of the mode of decision making. The second thing is then again the content. And the content seems to be revolutionary here again, but what's being overcome is no longer the, you know, Soviet past all that much, but it's a particular model, a particular sort of European Western-centric model of progressive values. And that's supposed to be overcome via this narrative of Christian victimhood, which I think you describe very convincingly. But if that's the case, then how much does this style of politics, in your opinion, depend on the pathway chosen before? So one way of arguing this would be to say that, well, this is what happens when we have a system that starts from a revolutionary pathway, but we don't manage to constitutionalize the charisma of the revolution, right? That's the Polish case, I think, in Bruce's book. And that process fails. And so we are sort of left with a kind of, you know, it's kind of a shadow of the revolutionary model, but it's not quite that because there isn't actually mass mobilization. Or, and perhaps both at the same time, is this something that happens in the elite pathway as a means to overcome the authenticity problem that is present in that system? So, and both may be the case, right? And that would be, as I understand you, your Hungarian example more like it. So I would be interested in your take on that. And that connects to one last point I wanted to make, which is what is the relationship of legitimacy and identity? And I think this has come up in some of the previous days as well. So broadly speaking, is it a condition for constitutional legitimacy that the constitution shapes national identity in some way? And in the revolutionary model, that's fairly straightforward because the revolution defines us who we are and what we want. So that's sort of the easy path. In the traditional model, again, that's pretty straightforward because the identity is shaped by the past, by who we were. And is the elite model now then that the identity in the elite model is shaped by overcoming the past or something like that? So we again have and if so, is it, but it seems to me that that is not actually what sort of we've been talking about the last few days. And this is not entirely corresponding to what Bruce wants to say, because he's interested in regimes and modes of decision making, not all that much in this sort of expressive force of the Constitution. But nevertheless, it seems to me to be playing a certain role there, even though I'm not entirely sure what it is. So I think I'll end here, and then we have enough time for the discussion, hopefully. Thanks to all of you. I enjoyed reading these.
Thanks. Michaela, you put lots of questions on the table, many of which force us to consider some of the threats that emerge from the workshop. I would emphasize the question on identity that you were posing. Perhaps smuggling through is also that's more of a joke, but referring to the establishment pathway. But very importantly, also pointed to the shifts in terms of the paths, that I think it is something that we will come back in the discussion, and of course we'll come back tomorrow. Before we open the discussion, we have already lots of questions being chat. Is the chance of Bruce Ackerman to intervene on the presentations and the comments of Michaela?
Great, thank you very much. So let's begin with Michaela. Thank you very much. What fills the gap? That is the key question for the establishment model that we're talking about. And so let's move to Justin first. The thing that fills the gap, that legitimates the central legitimating institution, and is the Deutschmark. As Justin is suggesting, in fact, the role of the Constitutional Court during the early decades, we can go into details, but we won't, is relatively not intrusive on the political process. We can talk about occasions in which the court actually intervenes cautiously and in the political process, but generally speaking, when it does, it ratifies the decisions of the political process. But it's the German bank that is absolutely cannot be touched by the political process. It is precisely that which is understood by the population to be the central tool, institution in their ordinary lives, the Deutschmark, which accounts for the tremendous economic boom. Now, it is only in 1989 that it's the second revolution in Germany that things change. And how do they change? It is fascinating that so the real issue here is, Justin, it seems to me, is citing the wrong people in 1980. He's citing academics. The crucial actor is a Bückenförder. What does a Bückenförder say in 1990? And here I very much emphasize that a book that should be required reading for us and unfortunately is not even taken, has not yet been translated into German, is Stefan Yagi's The 1989 Revolution, The Lost Revolution. Birkenförder, who is the leading jurist of his generation, and is he's deputy head of the Constitutional Court at the time, writes an elaborate 46-page pamphlet, which is not in his collected works. It's not even put in there by the Germans, which insists that there must be a constituent assembly. The Schluss article requires a constituent assembly. It doesn't make it permissive. You just look at the text and it says, this is the reason this is not called a constitution, but a Grundgesetz is precisely because it is not the Verfassung, because of the failure of the participation of the East. We now have the participation of the East, a mobilized movement. This is precisely what the Schluss article contemplates, and it says there must be, not shall be, can be, may be, must be a constituent assembly. Why didn't it occur? Because Helmut Kohl bought out the East Germans by saying, you have your marks are not worth anything like our marks. We're going to permit you to exchange them one for one. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it unless he could get François Mitterrand's consent. Because of course, François Mitterrand is one of the occupying power, represents one of the occupying powers, thanks to Charles de Gaulle. The crucial consent, which is before Maastricht, is a document that they jointly agree to, in which I have the date here. It's I think December something, 1989, or is it? But it's often dated 1990. An express document which contemplates Maastricht, and it says, "Aha, yes, I, Mitterrand, will consent to your reunification of Germany notice, Helmut Kohl is doing this without requesting the consent of the German central bank. Says, to hell with you, unprecedented. What is the Supreme Constitutional Court? Nada. Unprecedented. He said, but Mitterrand says, I'm going to give consent on condition that you give up the Deutschmark. Kohl says, yes. And that is the document that is submitted to the council and is the foundation of moving to Maastricht in '92. It's at that point, okay, so this is the point number one in response to Michela. She's absolutely right. The authenticity problem generated by what? Let me go back a little bit to the first moment of the Constitution. It isn't, this word elite is being thrown around a little bit too much. who is Konrad Adenauer? Konrad Adenauer is not like Togliatti or like de Gasperi. He does not leave Germany. He stays in Germany quietly, without protesting, taking a pension from the German government. The analogy is not appropriate. There are one distinctive feature of the German Constitutional Court, another very fundamental thing, and I should say the original members of the Parliamentariat, they're not elected by the Länder. The Länder themselves, the people in the Länder are determined by the allies. It isn't like there are regular elections. No. So when we talk about, you see, elite is a fuzzy term here. I'm talking about the structure of representation. Moreover, the London Protocol, which is the document that tells the Parliamentariat what it has to do, specifies there shall be a referendum. Not maybe. And Adenauer's great act of defiance is he defies that. Leading again to Michael, what legitimates this? What legitimates this? Is there consensus? Not at all. The socialists are opposed to Adenauer. Adenauer wins elections, sometimes not by much, but it isn't as if there is, as in Norway, a consensus on policy. Not at all. It is rather that despite Adenauer's complete being quiet and accepting of the regime, his act of German defiance is against the Allies, not with the Allies. Another crucial fact is that the bureaucratic regime of the Nazis, the members of the bureaucracy who are working for the Nazis, remain in the bureaucracy. They are not purged, not at all, with the one exception. This is the one institution that in which is inhabited entirely by people who had no association with the regime, and that's the Constitutional Court. Because, now I'm going to say no association in the sense that they aren't guaranteed association. That is to say, because the Constitutional Court didn't exist. And so constitutional, and there you see the basic rationale, I'm simplifying greatly, was, well, all these bureaucracies continued, retained their continuity. After we repudiated the Nazi regime, but that doesn't mean the institutions of bureaucracy have been repudiated. The state still continues. But since there was no constitutional court, the selection process for the Constitutional Court could not be members of the court before. Moreover, copying the Americans, they actually wrote opinions rather than, as in the classical German model and the Italian model and the French model, you know, whereas you lose is the thing, and the academics say what the law is. The German's constitutional court from the beginning was juridically not continuous with the Nazi regime, had members who are actually the jurists who then write opinions. That is distinctive, but by no means is that central. I don't think that, you see, the central concept in the revolutionary pathway, as Michele was suggesting, is the notion of the movement party institution charisma, how the movement party's energy can be, if things go right, translated into an expressive constitution of political identity. That doesn't exist with time one at all. And at time two, it exists and is repressed over the protests of Birkenförder, such that 25 years later, even though Birkenförder is a great totem of the past, his protest is forgotten. So not forgotten, suppressed. Fascinating, fascinating. But after 1989, it is, and only then does the German Constitutional Court achieve a centrality. Wrap up in 1 minute. I want to wrap up in 1 minute by addressing only one of the fascinating issues of Renata's, and that is different forms of critique of the status quo. Some forms of critique of the status quo are universalistic. These are, for example, the Enlightenment against Christianity or Islam. In principle, a believer in the Enlightenment thinks that all people throughout the world are granted certain universal rights, foundational. All people should, in principle, become Christians or Muslims. This is very different from a culturalist critique of the status quo. A culturalist critique is one which speaks in terms of language first and foremost. So for Hungary, we recognize each other as Hungarians, just as we speak, regardless of whether we are Christians or not Christians. We can be Jewish Hungarians. George Soros is a Jewish Hungarian because he speaks Hungarian as a native language. The physically identifiable characteristics, I am Black. That is a different form of critique. Rather than thinking in terms of all of these critiques as critical of critique, all of them are critiques. And I think that Renata is correct that if one's looking around the world today, there are mixtures of these critiques. It nonetheless, we should be very careful about identifying their relationship to one another. I would say, for example, that the Hungarian Revolution, which began, I should emphasize, in 1956, and then Imre Nagy in 1987, the great, this is a revolutionary tradition from 1956. Imre Nagy, the Hungarian revolution of the present time is a culturalist revolution first, while Christianity is only a secondary feature of it. So they would very much want to expand the border of Hungary so as to include Hungarian-speaking people not within Hungary right now. That would be a great thing. All right, well, I apologize for, there are, of course, meta-methodological issues, especially the ones that Mariana raised, which I would love to discuss, and I will promise you I will try to bring them in tomorrow.
Thanks a lot. So we have first, before we open the discussion, we have enormous amount of questions. As I anticipated, there will be a very brief, extremely brief, and I will be ruthless in, like Monty Python, ruthless devotion to the Pope. I will be ruthless in ensuring that this brief. The three speakers have something like 2-3 minutes to reply to Michela and to Professor Ackerman. So, Justin?
I think I will just cede that time because my responses to them, I think, can be incorporated into my responses to the questions in the chat.
Okay. Renata?
I'd rather go with Justin. I have comments where I combined, so let's do that. Okay.
So, Marianne? The micro is off.
I join the majority opinion, so.
Okay, so then we go straight into the many questions that were coming from the chat. I propose there are several questions. I have here at least 5 questions that were posed at some points. So I would propose that Justin, Renata, and Marianne go and they select 1 or 2 issues that they want to focus, and then they construct their replies on that basis. It would be possible. For technical reasons, we cannot make everybody speak, but I think it is possible that technical possibilities are not so limited with those people that are speakers in the webinar. So I think it would be possible to have Mike Wilkinson to present his questions in oral form and video form. So Mike, if you are you there?
Yes, can you hear me, Agustin?
Yes, so okay. Please go ahead.
So I will just read the questions because I think that will be quicker. So my first one also to Justin. As others have argued, the story of post-war dignified reaction and charismatic anti-Nazism is based more in myth than reality. Moreover, many of the concrete post-war constitutional developments reflect conservative positions from early Weimar, e.g. early 1920s jurists turning to judicial review to protect private property. The question I have is how this elite construction and myth sustains legitimacy in a more contemporary era, particularly after reunification. Is it still the active fear of we the people, or more a question of acquiescence or passivity in conditions of relative prosperity, where relative is an important term here in the context of EMU, creditor and debtor relations? And the second question I have for Renata, I think follows a question that that Agustin put as well, and indeed that others have followed with, and it's to do with the characterization of Orban's regime. Hungarian political economists, critical ones I should say, have described the regime as authoritarian neoliberalism, which is a modern version of Hermann Heller's authoritarian liberalism. Indeed, I would suggest authoritarian populism, as the term is often used, is the flip side of authoritarian liberalism, in mutual dependency with it and reinforced by EU membership. The question can then be put bluntly, far from representing a rupture, isn't Orban's regime type the conservation of the status quo? And that this shouldn't surprise us, because the 1990s wave of enlargement was more about market making than democracy building. So something of a rhetorical question, but a question nevertheless. Thank you, Agustin.
Thanks a lot. I will try to add to these the questions that Bojan was asking, if I manage to scroll here properly through the window. The window in my computer is very small, but I think I will manage to find oh God, too many questions. I think there is one that was posed by Marco Goldoni, so he can to Justin, so he can put that himself also, because we can technically do that with Marco.
Yes. So I have actually two questions. One is for Justin, and I think part of the discussion of the debate will go probably in that direction. It's about, again, the institutionalization of charisma. I mean, Paul Kahn has this theory that the US Supreme Court do actually enjoy charismatic authority because they would be the representative institution of we the people. And therefore there would be some sort of constitutional culture that somehow enables the possibility that, as someone has put in the chat, judges are not popular, but they are actually somehow the center, the object of a certain particular type of belief, and which is a belief basically based on popular sovereignty. Now, my question would be, in an environment where constitutional culture has probably not been shaped by the principle of popular sovereignty, whether this notion of charisma can actually be really available at all, not just for judges, but in general. So, in the case of Kahn, my impression is that Kahn's approach postulates that you need to have a certain type of constitutional culture in order to be able to enjoy that type of charisma. So I want to hear what you think about this. What are basically the conditions of possibility to have charismatic judges? And then I have a question for Marian. And what do you think, what is in the economy of the Spanish transition, the constitutional meaning of the failed coup of 1981, right? I hope I get the date correct, because I mean, I've probably read too much Javier Cercas, and this is probably my lame literary taste, so I apologize for that. But it seems to have been actually an extremely important passage, you know, in the consolidation of what looks like, you know, a certain type of elitist transition, which infuses, you know, an element of patriotism, so to say, embodied by that Spanish elite.
Sorry, before we give the floor to Justin to reply, I add the question of Giri. The risk of conceptual, and he's relating to the risk of conceptual confusion. What is the difference between charisma and popularity? Is charisma measurable as popularity? I doubt it. However, how something strange happens here. How is the Germany's basic law popular in the new lands of post-1990 unified Germany? This was relating to, I think, a general question that I was referring, whether it actually makes sense, even from a Weberian point of view, to stretch too much the concept of charisma. For example, when Weber is talking about the, if I'm not wrong, when Weber is talking about the routinization of charisma, he's talking about a shift from one legitimacy type to another. So we are beyond charisma. a priest may be charismatic, the church is not charismatic. So we are referring to something, but should we use the label charisma? And if I manage, and that's a big if, I think Boyan was also asking a question to Justin, but perhaps we go to Justin. I try to make order with the chat because I'm making a mess out of it. So please, Justin.
Okay, well, thank you for all of these really wonderful and insightful questions. There's a lot there. I'm going to do my best to be brief, but still responsive. So let me start off with the question of charisma. So I used it in what I hoped was a provocative way, and it clearly has provoked, but now let me clarify just a little bit. Yes, I think of charisma in the constitutional sense being a figure like George Washington, who before there is a Declaration of Independence, before there's a Continental Army, before there's a flag, and certainly before there's a constitution, incorporates the cause, right? He is the cause of the rebellion. He constitutes the cause and has to help literally constitute the army and fight the war, and eventually you transfer that into a constitution. There's obviously nothing like that in Germany. There's no figure that embodies the anti-Nazi cause that's present at the creation of the Constitution. And so my point here is just to say that you go from a constitution that has no popular attachment and almost no popular attention in 1949 to something that does have popular attention and popular attachment later on. Now we can debate about how much or how to measure that. I'm just trying to say, well, what is it that drives that difference? Do we have charisma is probably not the right term to call that, but there is this phenomenon. There's a phenomenon of attachment to the constitutional order and to the constitutional court as the institutional guardian of that order. Where does that come from, and what should we call it? What does that mean for the elite pathway? Is there something about the pathway that drives that? And so I would be open to names for that. The term constitutional patriotism has been used in different contexts and to different ends. So maybe that wouldn't be useful either. And the question of popular sovereignty, I guess this brings us back to the normative, descriptive question. But I think that the German Constitutional Court definitely does use the language of popular sovereignty. It begins every judgment by shouting "Im Namen des Volkes," in the name of the people, and its jurisprudence about European unification is shot through with the rhetoric of popular sovereignty, right? Of the democratic legitimation that has to come from the people. Now that might be inauthentic, but they definitely do use the language, and at least some people seem to buy in. And there are moments in post-war German history where you see an interesting dynamic. And one example I use is the 1983 census decision. You have a law that is passed unanimously by all of the parties in Parliament, and the Constitutional Court strikes it down. In the process, recognizing a right to personal data self-determination, and is celebrated to the skies by the German people in response to that. And it's almost seems like a case where, as a sociological matter, the court is speaking for the people against the politicians. So I'll just throw that out as a kind of an impressionistic type example. In response to Mike's question, I think you're absolutely right. And my most recent book, I've talked about two different ways of responding to an evil past. A redemptive one where you aggressively assume the mantle of antithesis aversion. We are responding to this past, redeeming it. We are going to instantiate the opposite of it. But the other one being a parenthetical approach, where you place a bracket around that past and reach back to an earlier, nobler tradition and try to establish continuities. And I actually suggest that a successful constitutional order will do both. And I think what you see in Germany is that what you're describing is some of that parenthetical mode. You reach back before Nazism to an earlier tradition and establish a kind of continuity with that. Michaela has written a great paper a few years ago about the extent to which we sometimes exaggerate anti-Nazism as an explanation of the German Constitutional Court and the Basic Law's success. But I would suggest that the court establishes itself as an anti-Nazi institution in a relative sense, right? And this is what Bruce is talking about. This is the only leading institution in the early 1950s, some of whose members are of Jewish descent, some of whose members were exiles and emigres during the war period. And it's that contrast that allows the court in certain cases to assume that anti-Nazi mantle. Now that could be exaggerated, and there are plenty of cases in which they don't do it, but they do it more than anybody else does. I may have a little bit more to say about this later on, but I don't want to take too much time right now. The question about attachment to the Constitution in East Germany, I don't feel particularly qualified to respond on that, other than to say I think it's ambivalent in the same way that East German attachment to the Federal Republic writ large is ambivalent. But I'll stop there because I want people to be able to pose questions to others.
Yeah, before I give the floor to Renata, I just read very quickly the question that I was not able to find from Bojan Bugaric. Gabor Halmai claims that Orban is a fake populist. He uses populist rhetoric, but in essence, he is an authoritarian leader. What do you think? So the floor is for Renata, then for Marianne, and then we still have to complete the first round with Michela and Marco.
Thank you very much, Augustine. I will try to a little bit organize the responses. So one of the important points Michaela is making, that the paper is not very clear about, the various pathways: elite, establishment, revolutionary. And what I was trying to show is that this is a story about how easy the travel between the modes is, and how easily the protagonists, who are strategic, actually travel between these modes. And if they manage, they actually manage to constitutionalize various steps along the way, which I think is, and I think it's extremely important that there is this seriously pronounced element of strategically choosing one or the other mode, depending on what suits for local power maximization best. And what I think is crucial is that it's not so much that they follow a recipe. So if you go outside Bruce's frames and go with the standard approach, there is a handbook or playbook of autocratization, which first does the judiciary, then the media, then, yeah. What this frame permits you to see how much choice there is, and instead of the recipe, there is plenty of trial and error. So if something doesn't resonate well, then it's abandoned. Like Sunday closing was abandoned in Hungary. The Polish government is backtracking on abortion in spectacularly monkeyistic ways. So I think that's one crucial point. The other crucial point is that apart from trial and error, that these guys are learning. They are learning from, they might not be terribly original with their ideas. I mean, borrowing from the Pope is not the most innovative thing on earth, but what you actually do with that on the ground is innovative, for which they are not given credit. And there is plenty of collaboration, both bilateral and supranational, which I was trying to emphasize. And I think that when we are telling this story about these players, that bit is not told often enough. Another point which I think matters about how they choose what they do is that they are absolutely not thriving for ideological coherence. So if you look at the Orban story, we start with localist critiques. We start with Hungary for the Hungarians and Hungarianness. We start with a little bit of anti-communism that doesn't resonate in Hungary. It does a little better in Poland. And in a way, they jump to this universalist language in the case of Orban, and this is a part in the written text, in order to please the US. So Hungary first activates we are the saviors of persecuted Christians at the first ministerial, which is organized by Secretary Pompeo. Hungary at that point is a little unpopular because they went after an American private university, CEU. They are on a beauty parade in Washington, and they figured this out, that the best, what they find resonance with is protecting persecuted Christians far, far away in order to prevent them from coming to Europe. And then this becomes also, then they parade this line also in the UN, and when it works globally, then they transport it locally. So instead of a peer-to-peer Hungarian-Polish learning curve, what you see is a much larger network of learning and cooperation. Mikhaila's other point was about constitutionalizing charisma. Now, in 1989, in a way, in Poland, you had way too many potential charismatic players. I would argue, and I know that I'm not going to be popular. In Hungary, you had very few. You were trying to script normalcy. The only serious contender for hero status was Imre Nagy, and the only event is his reburial. Now, Imre Nagy is I hear follow István Rév, and I think it's a side discussion about whether you buy Rév's argument in retroactive justice or not. I fully do buy him. I mean, Imre Nagy is a particularly interesting figure because ultimately he was a Moscow-trained hardcore communist, which made him a really difficult hero to sell in 1989 in transition to democracy. So in 1989, the business in Hungary, I doubt, was legitimizing charisma. In 2010, I think it's legitimizing, it's scripting Hungarianness, but that runs out in terms of its mobilizing potential. And after all, what these regimes require for re-election is constant mobilization. And this is where I can come to. I mean, there are plenty of examples of how it's piecemeal. For instance, the anti-communist agenda in Hungary is constitutionalized with the Fourth Amendment, with Article U, which I can only remember because it's my family name, right? But then they never actually carry out the transitional justice program, which they scripted in a page-long article. And when it comes to the establishment dimension of this whole story, Orban's Minister of Interior has always been a guy who was senior in the communist secret services. So when it comes to establishment pathways and continuities, this is hard not to, it's hard to ignore when you go deep context. Now, why do they keep mobilizing? Because ultimately they need to have a smoke screen for looting. So the economic policy is not really autocratic neoliberalism. You can trust Bálint Nagy this is the mafia state at its best. This is private. This is mafia state is his description of how property relations and business ownership changed in the country under Orban. The mafia state is funded by EU funds. So it's not Russia, it's not oil and gas. It runs on EU funding, and you can see how much it's personally controlled, with how easily assets are transferred from one owner to the other in a consensual manner in huge quantities. So if we want to have Heller and authoritarian liberalism, it's not really true capitalism what this regime masks, but looting on an industrial scale, which the EU has absolutely no interest in controlling. And I think that's very clear to economic policy. If you look at Poland, the current government is on a very, very strong repolonization agenda in the banking sector and also in the media sector. They are not going to be able to do the personally controlled assets to the degree as they manage in Hungary, because it's a larger economy, but they also do rely on EU funding disproportionately, especially in agriculture. This is something that is more of a concern for the European Parliament at the moment than for the Commission or anti-corruption. And to respond to Boyan, I don't believe that being a populist and having strong personal authoritarian tendencies or autocratic tendencies is mutually exclusive of the other. Orban uses populist rhetoric, and at heart, he would probably centralize power a lot more, see the Enabling Act. But it seems that for his longer term survival and re-election, he is better off choosing not to go that far. And so I would emphasize strategic choices here, because these choices that he makes are scripted in familiar constitutional language. Look at the last constitutional amendment. He did not script ultimate emergency powers of the sovereign, but rather a multi-option set of emergency powers were put in place in the last amendment with all the Christian victimhood stuff in place.
Very good. So now is the turn for Marianne.
Thank you. I would like to go back to the couple of questions put by Michaela. One is important. The meaning of consensus applied to the process of transition in Spain has a very definite meaning and is not the general one. So consensus at that time meant that the minority political parties, which were the parties originally in the opposition, even the clandestine forces, were allowed to maintain always the heart of their opinions, in the sense of not betraying their more essential points. So they were not exactly veto players, but it was simply that the mechanical majority of the right was not imposed through the process of elaborating, of making the constitution. Because of that, the result is said to be a constitution of everybody, able to cover the targets, the purposes of right and left. And that is very important. But the consensus, which appears to be a great value of transition, today has become an unsurmountable obstacle to reform of the constitution. So the reform procedure established inside the constitution has proved a failure in the case of Spain. It is impossible, because the conditions are only if they meet consensus. And this is impossible because we are in a completely different political time. So that is not going to be repeated. In that sense, the reconciliation spirit has a lot to do with this value of the consensus. And only one more point about the question by Marco and about the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court really we followed the German and Italian models, so that is clear, and was very, very instrumental, very useful, and in my opinion, a great idea to have a Constitutional Court. It solved a lot of problems with the training of the ordinary judges. So we had some kind of judicial schoolmaster with the Constitutional Court, and that was very important to build very quickly a corpus of constitutional doctrine non-existent in Spain. Of course, it came in great masses from Germany and Italy also. Well, we had other influences, but these were the most relevant. The Constitutional Court was also a symbol of reconciliation. In the first composition of this court, the president was a jurist who had gone in exile and came back to Spain. And he had been even part of the Republican army during the Civil War. And inside the same Constitutional Court was also another member who had taken part in the Civil War in the other band. In that sense, it was also a symbol of reconciliation, a different way of thinking about the Constitution. Marco has put the issue about the influence of the importance of this notable event that was the coup d'etat in 1981. The book by Cercas is a very interesting one. He has a lot of reflections, considerations about the ethics of betrayal. That's very interesting in the case of Spain. So forgetting the old loyalties to the Francoist regime. And I think it was the point in which the king could liberate himself from his past, because he had been the king of the first government immediately after the death of Franco. So some of the leaders of this coup, some of the leaders declared themselves monarchists, but they were loyal to that other king, the king who had swear the principles of the Francoism, and that was not the king under the constitution. So I think for him, this was very important. And of course, there was a massive demonstration upholding the constitutional legality. For other seminar, I will be speaking about the problems in Spain about the Spanish identity. For a while, there was a very successful slogan saying Spain is different. And what the people wanted during the transition was becoming like other Europeans, so not being different. And because of that, and also because the construction of a national glorious history during the whole Francoist period, there is a problem about discussing the essence of what does it mean to be a good Spaniard, etc. Not to speak about nationalisms in Spain. So.
I guess Calamandrei would refer to Article 9.2, but that's not the question. We have three to go in the next round. Is Michela, Marco Dani, and Bruce Ackerman. So please, Michela.
Right. First of all, thanks to all. I would just like to make some sort of fairly predictable comments on the German case. So, and I've written about this before, and I don't want to hijack this debate to sort of rehash old arguments. But if So basically, and that's still an answer to Mike's question to Justin to some degree, I think the never again narrative for Germany plays a role, in particular in recent history. It didn't play that much of a role initially. I mean, I'll still have to read Justin's book, and I've said that in the chat, we'll have a book discussion next week. So if you're interested, come and join that, and maybe I'll revise when I've read Justin's recent book. But I'm suspicious. I think while the German Constitutional Court is a new court, there are judges on there that have a very bad Nazi history. Willi Geiger is the classic case, right? He was a prosecutor at a Nazi special tribunal, and nevertheless, he's on that Constitutional Court together with a lot of emigres. But so there are my sense is that in the top ranks, you don't see that many Nazis, but you see a few, and the court is no different in that regard. So I think that the German never again narrative in particular plays a legitimating role in the recent decades, and to some degree, and this would be, and there are better people than me to speak about that, but if I'm allowed one provocative comment that is not backed up by extensive research, I would say there is a certain sense today of German superiority, which is based on we've been there, we've done that, we've learned from that experience, and now we're the most wonderful of all, and we tell you all how it's really to be done. And I think there's a lot of sort of German snobbery around, which is based to some degree on that, and which is ironic in many ways. About Eastern Germany, I think research is still to be done. I would back Bruce's call to read Stefan Jagi's book. But there is also, I mean, a broader story to be told yet, which I think people like Yuri, who's in the audience, and Janko Marek, who will be speaking at other points about Eastern Europe. There's a story like that to be told about Eastern Germany, I suspect, that is quite resembling the stories that are going on in other parts of Eastern Europe. But we still sort of need to tell that. I don't think anyone has sort of done the work necessary to put the pieces together. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Very good. Marco Dani.
Yes, thank you, Agustin. I have a question for Renata and Marianne. And it is based on the idea we had when we designed this panel. The idea was to take seriously the authenticity challenge that is the crux of the elite constitution, as we have heard today from Michaela, from Professor Aken. And we selected the three cases essentially by providing the obvious example of success story, Germany, although we heard today that success is not entirely the product of the Constitution and the Constitutional Court, but there is something else, the political economy, the Deutsche Mark. Then we had the case of the failure, and we considered Hungary as the failure because we thought that the elite constitution in the Hungarian case was the 1989 constitution, which was entirely a product of elites, the roundtable talks, and then the socialist parliament approving the constitution, a constitution which was meant to be temporary. It was written in the preamble, and there needed to be a new constitution which was never approved. The elite at the time considered it was sufficient to have an effective constitutional court to elaborate the principles of the 1989 constitution. But that turned out to be a failure not because the constitutional court, of course, failed in enforcing those principles, but because of exogenous economic and political dynamics, basically the financial and economic crisis of 2007-2008, which, at least from what I read, is one of the main drivers of the rise of Orban and Fidesz. So that was the failure example. And then we have Spain. Spain, which is the most dubious case because it was normally regarded as a success story until the point in which also the legitimacy of the Spanish Constitution has started to be questioned. And it has started to be questioned since the ruling on the Statute of Autonomia in Catalonia, and increasingly so with all the dynamics following that ruling and following, of course, the attempted referendum and the attempted independence. I would like to hear your view, Renata and Marianne, in this reconstruction, if you consider that this charting of the cases is accurate or it is oversimplified. Thanks.
Professor Ackerman.
Well, let me think here. I want to make clear which of these nations I believe are on which track. Hungary is on the revolutionary track. The notion that at every point in time from 1956, when people like George Soros leave and other leading people leave the country and are critical of it, to 1989, through this entire period, after the regime collapses, the notion that every protagonist is trying to win elections. That's, of course, the case. The question is, what are the modes of argument that they are presenting? I very much reject Renata's saying in 1989, there's no one there who is a credible spokesman for the revolution. That's Renata's opinion. That isn't what these people are presenting themselves as. Now, we have to, and this is a fundamental response to Marianne's point, we have to make a distinction between two different elements of the institutions of in which the ultimate decision is made by voting. What are the institutions that structure the voting process? How, so for example, do you have to get 7.5% of the vote in order to get into the assembly or not, or the threshold or not? Are there two branches of a parliament or only one? So all of these, is there a presidential system or a parliamentary system? Voting is central in all of these three models. Now, when we say there is a consensus in Germany, what are you talking about? There's Alternative für Deutschland. That's a Nazi party. And it got 15% of the vote. The fact that right now it is saying, the Constitution of Germany is the greatest thing, that's just the kind of strategy that everyone takes. That's not to be taken seriously. The thing that is to be taken seriously is that this is a parliamentary system, and that the other political parties say, no, we're not going to do 15, we're not going to deal with you. Not because these other parties have a consensus. To the contrary, they are, there's going to be an election soon, and the question is rather, will the Green Prime Minister, Green Party person be the Prime Minister? That's not a consensus. That's the breakdown of the old party system. Yet the institutional mechanism is parliamentarian. Now, in France, there's also 15 or 20% of the population, Marine Le Pen, that are tremendously in favor of Marine Le Pen. But because we have a presidential system, which is the structure of the institutions of voting, she may well become the next president. I'm interested in this institutional system. Now, the thing that's dramatically absent from Justin Collings' discussion is voting. He is constantly saying, oh, the people, you look at the press. No, we want to know the voting is the crucial thing, and it is the case that the Christian Democrats, in contest with the Social Democrats, in very strong contest, were the dominant party, with the socialists coming in sometimes. Now, the next point that really is terribly important to emphasize, that there are too many people here who are looking back retrospectively as if they know how the story ended. Notice, it's Francois Mitterrand. He is not merely a social democrat, he is trying to repudiate the Gaullist policies of, and to have a really strong socialism. And he is struggling against the Constitutional Court, as I described in the book. That's what is happening in 1989. And it is Lech Walesa who is, and the Pope, the Polish Pope, who is, what is Lech Walesa? He was thrown in prison. He is on the victory side of things. It isn't neoliberalism. And in Spain, we have a social democrat. Et cetera, and so forth. You should not read what the puzzle for us today. See, I'm looking at history so that we could look to the future. What is the future? How can we put our crisis today in perspective of the previous turning points? And it is the crucial aim of my book is to invite you not to say, aha, well, it all worked out in 30 years, so that neoliberalism is triumphed. How did this happen? People didn't think that was going to happen in 1989, that something called unregulated capitalism was going to triumph. That was not what that's not what Lech Walesa is dying for, and that's not what George Soros is doing. And when you say, oh, well, you know, it was a strategic effort to butter up the Americans to say, aha, really the CEU is trying to educate the people from the East, which is true, by the way. Well, that's just buttering up, you know. No, this is an effort. What's happened with the CEU was the effort to destroy George Soros, and it succeeded. Right? It succeeded. Now that goes to this crucial point that Marian was emphasizing. You see that the standard form of comparative law is the distinction between civilian systems and common law systems. What my three models are trying to do is to say, no, that isn't the right way of doing comparative constitutional law. I'll just, rather, it's to understand three or maybe four, however many, pathways to legitimation. Now, the Spanish case was successful for 50 years. How long do you expect us to think to be successful? 50 years is a long time, not a short time. Why was it successful? And here I must say, Marian, you are contradicting yourself, I think. You keep on talking about consensus in 1975 through 1981. At the same time, we're talking about riots in the streets and the effort in the on the area near Portugal to revolt and join Portugal. The communists are not organized. They are very well organized. They have been mobilizing and labor unions for decades, and they've been suppressed. This is, as it were, Ackermanian time one in terms of revolutionary activity. Now, at time two, rather than actually joining together the different liberal, social democratic, communist groups as happened in Italy, they were crushed militarily. Then we have 1981. Rather than talking about autobiography, that is not, and what we have here is a really, Franco from the 1940s is anticipating his own demise. Incredible. What does he do? He takes a king, takes a child who is in the royal family, takes him away from his father, and brainwashes him. And makes him into a loyal fascist, or so he believes. Amazingly, this is Freud, if you like. The king from as soon as Franco dies, declares that he is. This is a really weird situation, right? Here is a fascist state whose chosen successor is a monarch. The analogy here, of course, is Victor Emmanuel. The right comparison is between the revolutionary pathway that is taken in Italy and the establishment coercive pathway that is taken in Spain, which, however, despite the authenticity problem, despite the fact that many people are killed on the eastern frontier militarily, and and there is this ongoing political struggle. It worked. Why? Well, says my teacher, Juan Lintz, and I'm building on Juan Lintz, it's because of parliamentarianism. It's because of parliamentarianism. It's because and that's why it worked. And you know Juan Lintz's argument. We can talk about them tomorrow if you like. My basic thesis here is that it is simply a mistake when we're looking to the 20 years, 2020, 2030, to think that Hungary, Spain, and Italy are traveling along the same pathway. That Germany is traveling along the same pathway. No, Germany is traveling along this third pathway that emphasizes the question of authenticity. And Justin has not yet answered the question Justin embraced the regime conception in his first outstanding book. I want him to reclaim it. If we take the regime perspective, we see that it is a parliamentary system that accepts the old establishment for a generation until the 1960s, when the next generation begins to challenge the foundations of the regime, and this revolution fails. And then we move on to the next generation of 1989, and this generation is on the verge of success with Birkenfurter at its helm, and Kohl bides it out. Okay.
Because we have to.
Sure, of course.
Move. Yeah, I think now I will give the floor to the three paper givers before we close down. I would like to stress, and I get this from some messages, that our attempt to inject one way or the other political economy is not really taken. So perhaps a final effort to try to grab that. And I would say in that regard, on the basis of what Bruce was referring, I beg to disagree with the question that in the 90s or in the early 90s, it was difficult to figure out what was in the cards, taking into account how the transition to capitalism was being orchestrated in Eastern Europe, in the same way that there were many people that predicted what would come out of an asymmetric monetary union in the Eurozone. The question is, to what extent mainstream liberal thinking, to be very clear about what I'm saying, got it wrong. And the direction in which we are moving is not the direction that was predicted in the 90s. We are moving, and this is the reason, for example, that Mike Wilkinson, that I think is still with us, has been hammering on the relevance of Hermann Heller, Authoritarian Liberalism, his very last article before leaving Germany, which I think that remains relevant today. But it's not my role to speak a lot, but just to give the floor to the three speakers. So please, Justin.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go back to the big question that Michaela posed, which is what does account for the German success story, so long as it was a success story. And I think that there are multiple factors. I think political economy plays a part of it. You had a political economy that was both accepted by lots of people and that produced unprecedented prosperity. But I think there's more. So in 1954, so very early in the history of the Constitutional Court, the Chief Justice, the President of the Court, Hermann Hübker-Aschoff, dies. And one of the obituaries in the paper says that the Chief Justice and his court had helped to reestablish the rule of law in Germany, which was such a salutary thing amidst so much frenzied talk about an economic miracle. Now, I'll say parenthetically that, yes, this paper I didn't talk much about voting, but I talked a lot about voting in the book, in my earlier book. That the problem with voting is people don't vote about the court, and they've never voted about the Constitution. And it depends on which election you look at. So today, you can see a consensus coming apart. In 1980, you see a pretty powerful consensus, not a big gap between two parties, and those two parties account for over 90% of the vote. But what I think the Constitution has provided that accounts for its popularity is a sense of meaning, a moral miracle to match the economic one. There aren't a lot of acceptable forms of common identity in post-war Germany. History is tainted by the Holocaust. I'm following Dieter Grimm here. The nation is divided. Culture is the only thing that links the West to the East. The Constitution helps to fill that gap and to rehabilitate some of those other things. So you get a different account of history that draws on liberal traditions in the 19th century, democratic traditions in Weimar. You get anyhow. I should wrap up, but this can be taken too far, and this is the notion of Sühnenstolz, that the pride of atonement that Michaela points to. But constitutional patriotism has provided a permissible, non-threatening form of patriotism. I think that's a sense of meaning and identity, in addition to the economic prosperity and political stability. Let me say something just quickly about the East. Buchenford is not the only justice calling for a referendum. So Marenholtz, who's the vice president of the court, does. Dieter Grimm does. And it doesn't happen, but it's interesting that the most prominent public officials calling for the referendum are justices of the Constitutional Court. And it's the court, more than any other institution during the 1990s, that seems to integrate or at least recognize Eastern interests in a handful of important judgments. The final thing question that I'll raise is, does it matter the extent and the intensity with which the jurisdiction itself poses the authenticity question? There isn't a lot of talk in Germany about the counter-majoritarian difficulty. There isn't an insistent discussion about the lack of popular endorsement. And what are we to make of that? Anyhow, I'll stop there. Sorry to take too much time.
Thanks a lot. Renata, please.
Thank you very much, Agustin. First to Marco, and I would respond to this in two installments. One is that one way of reading Orban's revolution in the voting booth in 2010 is that this is his response to the authenticity challenge in an elite constitution-making setup. He never ran on, so in 2010, he didn't run on a constitutional crisis agenda. He didn't run on saying that they will install a new constitution. And so they literally needed to manufacture a constitution making moment. And they produced an elite constitution. This was drafted by 3 people and adopted in parliament with no referenda. There was a hasty national constitution national consultation before, which had no, they couldn't potentially process the responses before Parliament adopted the text. And the revolutionary rhetoric is to make up for the authentic, if anything, for the authenticity problem. Now, in terms of whether 1989 was a failed elite constitution, I'd be really treading carefully here. Yeah, it didn't lead to another constitution, which potentially was promised and then never delivered. It also resulted in several constitutional amendments and the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court, which very deeply embedded it in the European multi-layered constitutional architecture without an eternity clause. Now, before we label it a failure, don't forget that in 2010, after the revolution in the voting booth, Orban keeps the parliamentary system, so he doesn't switch to presidentialism despite punditry to this effect. He doesn't ditch the Constitutional Court. He tinkers with the rules, so he's tinkering on the edges. And while people are claiming constitutional coup in one corner, people in the other corner are saying that these are minor cosmetic changes. What is the fuss about? Your problem is his politics. So in a way, for Orban and the regime itself, it took several steps to actually kill the 1989 constitution. Remember, they passed an amendment which prohibited the Constitutional Court from using its old jurisprudence, which the court decided to do anyway, right? So I'd be really very careful here. In terms of the economic crisis, I mean, there was a. I'm not questioning the economic difficulties, but this was never billed by Orban himself as a constitution-making moment. When people are voting for him before the election, and people are voting for him in 2014, by that time it's been 4 years as Orban, as the leader of the opposition, refuses to show up in parliament, refuses to do standard opposition politics. He keeps mobilizing through referenda, through organizing civic circles, and ultimately he plays outside the formal rules, but then he runs for prime minister and doesn't say when he's running that he wants a new constitution. And in a way we end up with the fundamental law, because with all the conditionality of the loans, he has zero policy space. And after coming up with this really ridiculous national declaration of national cooperation, all they can think of as a big bang policy project to keep mobilization going is doing a constitution, which they don't do in a participatory fashion. So I'd be careful there. Let me just say one thing to Professor Ackerman's. You distinguished between, and I put this down, between a charismatic revolutionary leader and a credible spokesperson for the revolution. These are two different animals in my head. But I said that there was no charismatic revolutionary leader, not one person. And I mean, credibility is a funky thing in 1989, because nobody on the opposition side had proper democratic legitimacy. These parties were coming up and labeling themselves parties. Many spoke for transition in terms of the legacy of the 1956 revolution. And people were being pretty moderate about what they stood for. So ultimately, the most credible spokesperson for the legacy of the revolution becomes the new president of the Republic, Arpad Gönc, who himself has been a political prisoner, and his charisma is decidedly that of the grandfather of the nation. So that's I stopped the Hungarian history lesson here, and I barely ever get to mention Arpad Gönc anymore. But I really kept this very careful distinction between the one charismatic leader and multiple potential speakers for certain legacies who may or may not have had roles, formative roles at the drafting table.
Very good. Marianne, please.
Very briefly. Well, the issue of Catalonia is not to solve in 5 minutes. I would merely well, remember that it came well, during the Second Republic in the 30s. There was an attempt to build integrated state was the name, so something between the federal state and the regional state. What the constituents tried was this state of autonomies, and the fact is that the territorial question is not well solved at all, and we cannot say that the regulation, the constitutional regulation, is unsatisfactory simply because it's not there. So the 8th title of our constitution rules for the process of constituting, of building the autonomous communities, but not for the system working with constituted autonomous communities. So the problem is that we have deconstitutionalized the territorial constitution, if I may call that way. And well, about the consensus and agreement, I am very happy to accept that I am a contradictory person, so I have no problem with that. But what I meant is that there is a specific consensus that is not what generally we understand for consensus, applied merely to the process of writing the constitution. So only at that point, and the result was several glorious agreements on certain points of the constitution, but also enormous lacunae and ambiguities and vague clauses, etc., in order to have this common denominator. And well, about authenticity, we have to go on with this channel. Thank you very much.
Okay, so slightly over time, we close this session and we return to the live world. And we hope very much that you will be back with us for the very last webinar tomorrow that will be devoted to the European Union. Thanks a lot.